with AI running in the background, it's going to start to push these changes to you. It's going to start to say, I've seen you do this 15 times. Do you want me to take this over for you? I've learned based on this. The dangerous side could be like, oh, I'm going to lose my job. These people are going to lose a lot of jobs because these are mundane tasks that have millions of people working on it. The positive side, if you look at the other way, is like, this frees up time to do more critical thinking. This frees up time where you're not doing the same thing, but you can challenge yourself and actually push the limits of what's possible because time is no longer a constraint.
Hi, I'm Boaz, founder and CEO of Simply Augmented, and I'm thrilled that you're tuned in to Shift AI today. Shift AI is a show that explores what it takes to thrive in a digital economy of remote work and AI. In today's episode, I am thrilled to have David Shim as our guest. David Shim is the CEO of Read.ai. He's a serial entrepreneur, and he's CEO of one of the most exciting AI startups in Seattle. If you're someone that's interested in what it takes to run a fast-growing startup, you're not going to want to miss this episode. I'm really excited to have David on this podcast, and I can't wait to learn more from him. Let's get to it. All right, David, thank you for joining us today on the Shift AI podcast. I am super excited to have you on.
No, thanks for having me. I'm excited to talk.
Well, I like to start talking about your background and reciting your background back to you, make sure that I get it right. It's an interesting background, a long one, and we can talk more about it. But let me start. It looks like right out of the gate, you're a founder of several companies, EcoBay, League Traders. And then right after that, you went to Avenue A Razorfish and were a data analyst there and a senior account manager. From there, you went to Faircast as a director of digital marketing, and then to Web Trends, and then to Quantcast. And then you became the founder and the CEO of Placed, which was then acquired. It was acquired by Foursquare, which you were there for a while as chief executive officer, CEO, which must have been a really interesting experience. And I also know that you're an angel investor that's seen a lot of deals and had a lot of experiences investing in startups, which I think is really interesting. And now currently you are the co-founder and CEO of Read.ai, which is a really, really interesting AI company that we're going to get more into. But did I get it right? I know there was a lot of stuff leading up to being the CEO of Read, but did I get it close?
No, you hit it right on the ball. I think you got a lot of different things in there. Some of them were shorter than others, but I think if we dive in early on, it really highlights with League Traders, with EcoBay. I didn't know any better. So this is kind of when you're in college, when you're a senior in high school, you're like, hey, there's a problem. I think I can solve it. And one was around stock trading, and I wanted to build a stock trading league. So this is before Wall Street bets by about 30 years. And I thought that it would be interesting to have a concept of, can I go into E-Trade? Can I go into Ameritrade back then, the different online brokers, pull down the trades that people were making, and then let people compete against one another with audited results? Now,
Got it.
It was an interesting idea. Trading wasn't that big at that point. There were people doing it, but it wasn't a big market. And ultimately, I was too young at that point, too. I think I was about 18, 19 years old at that point. And it was hard. I'm not certified. I don't have any connection to the space. I'm not a developer. It's really early in a nascent industry, which is online trading. So that ultimately didn't do much other than it got me through that first startup experience of like, what does it look like to do a business plan? What does it mean to actually say you're going to do something versus actually doing it?
Yeah. So when you got out and started doing startups, I mean, what led to the Razorfish job? And then from there, you started doing some really interesting projects and jobs. What did that transition look like from those early startups to that Razorfish job and then off, into data analyst jobs and then eventually to CEO jobs?
Yeah, with the Razorfish, it kind of highlights a lot of what I've done across my career, which is you get in early where you see an opportunity where you don't have necessarily people with 10, 20, 30 years of experience ahead of you, but rather it's a nascent space. And if you can pick that space at the right time, it does accelerate your career. So when I joined Avenue A Razorfish, digital marketing was there, but Google search and paid search actually hadn't even been released yet. It was more about the banner ads. Like, if people don't remember this, but there used to be banner ads in Google search right at the top. And so that's when I came into the space. And so what that highlighted was there's this huge opportunity of digital advertising. Nobody was measuring it other than to say, I put a banner ad and this is how many times the page loaded. And so taking that, we just went in really deep with the cohort of like, if you look at a lot of Seattle startups now, a lot of folks have that Avenue A DNA where they've gone out to build other very successful startups. And I think it's because we went into a space that was new. It was about the data. We dove into the data and we figured out how do we optimize that data to drive performance.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Well, let's take a step back here. The show is about AI, but it's also about work and about the future of work and about how work establishes our identity. So what was your first job pre all those startups where you actually got paid?
First job was I worked in a movie theater. It was the Alderwood 7, I believe. And I made popcorn and I served drinks. I still remember the price. It was $5.95 for a medium popcorn and a medium drink. And I got to get all my friends into movies and my family into movies for free. So that was a lot of fun.
Did you learn anything from that experience as being
I think just
front of the house?
That was just people person, like just going out and like being able to talk with many and many people over and over and just doing the pattern recognition. Like, okay, this person doesn't want to talk to me. I'm just going to tell them the price. Go for it. This person wants a little bit of chit chat. Hey, you can upsell this and I can win this thing in the back end. All right. And it just gave you that opportunity. And again, as a kid, you don't know any better. So for me, it was just kind of like a fun thing to say, let me try this. Let me see if this hits or not. And that experimentation was kind of fun at scale.
It's good training for CEO and for pitching to investors.
100%.
Speaking of being a kid, what was it like family-wise? Were your parents entrepreneurs? Did you talk about business as a family? Was that something that came up? What was it? What was that vibe like in the early years?
Yeah, that was core to our family's DNA. So my parents, college educated from Korea, they came over and with me when I was about like 2 or 3, I believe. And they came over and they had degrees, but they didn't speak English very well. And so ultimately they had to start their own business and they went into kind of the grocery store, the dry cleaner, like what you hear about Koreans, to be honest, like when they first come over in that first generation. And the reason, and we had a great life, it was hard, but what I saw them do was they couldn't necessarily win on mind alone because they didn't know the language, but they could win on brute force. And by brute force, I mean, it's like doing 18 hours a day, 19 hours a day to say, hey, I can only make this much per hour, but if I throw enough hours at it, that I could actually go in and stack these things. And it's almost like a startup. You have no product and you have to just throw yourself at it. As you start to get a little bit of traction, things become easier and easier. And I think I saw that with both my mom and my dad, where they really kind of went out in the market. And then my dad kind of split off where because of the work that he did, he interacted with so many people. He ultimately started selling cars. He started selling cars to a wide variety of people. And he was one of the best sellers in the late 80s when he was doing that.
That's amazing. So obviously that affected you. I can hear, in your voice that kind of shaped you in a lot of ways.
100%. Because it taught me like there isn't a problem you can't solve. Either you can do it if you're really smart and you can solve it with this elegant solution, or you could solve it with brute force, with resources of time that you have available. So it's less about a problem can't be solved. It's more about how can it be solved? And do you want to put the work into it? But for us, it was just like, no, we've got to go in. We've got to go to school. We've got to be able to pay the rent. We've got to be able to get a house. We've got to be able to get a car. All those things kind of were things where, hey, we have to do this. So how are we going to do it?
What was your favorite job as you look back on your career so far?
When I'm stressed, my favorite job is the movie theater, because the movie theater was, you didn't have to worry about it. It's like, I'm selling you popcorn. I'm selling you a soda. What's the worst thing that you can get? My popcorn's cold. No problem. I'm going to toss out 2 cents worth of popcorn and give you some fresh. I miss those days where I didn't have to worry about it, about kind of what I'm doing the next day, because it was just repetitive. But the most satisfying job is really starting Place and now starting Read, where it's really about kind of taking an idea with co-founders, with early employees and saying, 90% of the people don't know what we're doing. The same 90% also don't agree with what we're doing, but we think there is something here. And to actually build something from nothing is great. Like that I get a lot of joy out of that. And that's the most satisfying. But if you stack it up and you count like the days that are good versus the days that are bad, a lot of times the days that are bad are a lot more, but the days that are good are just so impactful that it kind of blows it out of the water.
Well, let's talk about Placed first, because that's a good story. And the acquisition was interesting. And then you had a chance to kind of work at Foursquare. So can you talk about that? And then we'll jump into Read.
Yeah, absolutely. So I started Placed back in 2011, solo founder. And what I learned through that was you could have an idea, but you also have to make sure that you have a strong core team. So we had early hires that were contractors that I brought on board, but they weren't bought in. They weren't willing to put the time in to solve specific problems in certain cases. They weren't bad. They just weren't, they weren't owners of the problem. And so what happened was, went through that. Then I started to find some people that were more in line with like, hey, let's build this thing. I want to own this. I'm willing to stay up till 2 without being asked to do that. And so that group, that early group, I think we've got like about 10 to 12 people. I worked together with them for about 8 or 9 years straight. So once we found that group, we worked together for an extended period of time. Wow. And what Place did was, it was location analytics. So the idea was iPhone 2 had just come out. Android hadn't been released yet. You could run a program on your smartphone that could actually get location data, and you can get location data in background. Mapping was in place where people were doing mapping. Foursquare was doing check-ins at that point. But what I wanted to do was say, hey, can I take a lot of that noisy location data, run a model against it, and assign that to a store visit? So rather than this lat long saying, I'm driving across the street, I want to see a series of locations where you slowed down, where when you went inside, you couldn't get GPS, but it became Wi-Fi or cell phone triangulation for your location. And so that was a lot of heavy lifting, because in those early days, there weren't a lot of location models outside of kind of the basic mapping. And so we did that. We did it for about 2 years. Madrona Venture Group was an early investor, and they were bought into the concept. And I went out in the market and I was like, hey, I've got location analytics. I can tell you after someone visits Best Buy, where else they go in the physical world. Best Buy actually was a customer of ours. They're like, this is great. This was about 2013 or 14. They said, normally on Black Friday, all of our execs go out on Thanksgiving. They go to either their stores or their competitors' stores. They survey people. They count how many people are in line. They ask when they leave, where are you going next, to really understand the movement of people. That year, they just used us, and we were able to go in and say, when someone went to a Best Buy, here's the next store that they went to and the store they went to after that. And they're like, this is phenomenal. It saves us time. The problem with that was not everyone has that problem case, that use case. So people were like, this is great. This is really cool. But what do I do that I know that people go to McDonald's after they go to the grocery store, not before they go to the grocery store? Like, how do I actually activate against that? And so we ran into this bottleneck where we had a really cool technology, a hard problem, but the market wasn't necessarily there at the time. And so what happened was in about 2014, a couple of people came to us and said, hey, mobile advertising is really big. Can you actually take the ads that we sell to people? There's an ID to say who received the ad. Can you map that against your audience? Because what we did was we used to pay people for their location data. So we went very transparent like Nielsen or ComScore does and said, we'll give you a couple bucks a month if you let us see where you go. We bumped those two things together, and we were able to actually say, if someone heard an ad on Spotify, did they then go into a McDonald's? And how long did that take? So that was a question where people were like, oh, this is phenomenal now. Like, you can't buy McDonald's on a mobile phone in those old days. But if you can say someone saw the ad, someone clicked on it, and then they went to a McDonald's location. So that got us product market fit, where we went very quickly to no revenue or very small amounts of revenue to growing very quickly to the point that we had been profitable from 2014 to about 2017 with over 100 employees. And then in 2017, Snapchat acquired us because they were building out their location stack. And then in 2019, Snapchat spun us out because they were refocusing on their core consumer business. But we had been growing during that whole time. So we were growing 30, 40% year over year during that time. And we spun out to Foursquare. And then fast forward to Foursquare, I was there for a couple months, and then the opportunity came up to be CEO, and they said, hey, do you want to be CEO? And I was like, I'm not sure. But then I was like, you know what? This is an opportunity I can't pass up.
Yeah. That's really, really cool. Okay. So then take me through what led from that experience to Read.ai, and then explain to the audience about Read. It's also a Madrona-backed company, really, really exciting AI company. To talk a little bit about the journey from that CEO position at Foursquare to Read.
So Foursquare was there for about 2 years. During that time, we acquired one of our nearest competitors. We got it to over 125 million in revenue. We got it to full year profitability. But I'd been in the location at that point for about 12 years. Also, I had then placed in 3 different variations. Like sold it to VCs in terms of getting funding, sold it to Snapchat, then sold it to Foursquare. And so for me, I wasn't a owner. I wasn't a founder at that point. I was more a caretaker because Foursquare was founded by Dennis Crawley and Naveen, and they did a great job. but I wasn't the founder of that company. So I gave the board about 6 months notice where I said like, hey, I'm thinking about, I would like to transition off. Let's do a good transition. And it was near the end of the year. And so they're like, appreciate it. And so as we started to do the transition, I didn't want to make decisions going into the next year because you never want to be the leader that said, hey, I'm making all these really big decisions and now I'm leaving. So it's all up to you. I kind of let my team make that determination on what they wanted to work on, but I had to guide the conversation. But as it got further and further near the end of the kind of my term, what I started to notice was, okay, there's 40 people on this call. And I can tell you right now, 15 of them don't have their cameras on. They're on mute. And I coined a term called ghost mode, where it's like, you're there, but you're not really there. I can't see you. Yeah. I can't hear you. But you're in there in spirit. Half the people, then you got 15 there out of the 40. You got another 10 where they're muted and they're kind of looking around. They're doing something else. They've got their phone and they're kind of looking here. So they're not participating. And there's maybe 2 or 3 people that are actually engaging in the conversation. So I was like, all right, this is not a good use of our team's time. So let's figure out like, what can we do here? And then I started to go in and say, you know what? This isn't a good use of time. Let's make these meetings smaller, but is there stuff that you could do there? And then what I really noticed was like on the audio and video side, are there any flags? Like beyond just talking, are there flags? You've got glasses on. Imagine if you were on ESPN.com, because I was on ESPN.com on one call, and I see in both cases that we're on the same webpage. That goes in and says, okay, it's clearly not a good use of both of our time if we're both on ESPN.com. So all those things were just kind of in the back of my head, left Foursquare. And then for about 3 or 4 months, I just started looking at different papers, went into different ideas. And the multimodal approach of engagement and sentiment wasn't something that was written about or there were many papers about. And especially with COVID, people weren't using it for video conferencing. They were more using like audio, where it's like the Alexa problem, where it's like, hey, natural language processing, is there tone, is there prosody associated with that? When it came to video, there wasn't wide scale video. Video was limited to, I'm doing a market research study. I want you to eat this. I want you to watch this movie. I want you to react to this commercial. And then they'll look at your facial expressions. But it's a very controlled environment versus all of a sudden now you've got almost 300 million people a day on video conferencing platforms where they weren't using video conferencing 6 months ago. And so that got me thinking like, and this goes back to kind of the opportunity. There's all this data. There's all this exhaust available. Everyone is tired. Remember that term Zoom fatigue that came out, or meeting fatigue that came out? And I was like, there's got to be a better way to do this. And so I started to go down the rabbit hole of, can you take those old papers? Is there something there that I can use and actually figure out sentiment and engagement to then figure out, is this meeting productive or not? That was the starting point. Is this a good meeting or a bad meeting for the people that are involved? And that's where we kind of started that problem set to explore like, what is possible with this data?
So when I think about Read, I think about that because I see some of the dashboards that show up. And for those in the audience that have used Read, when you have a meeting, that shows up for you on your right, and you can understand sentiment that's happening in that meeting based on everybody that's on the call. But also turns out that it's a great recorder and a summarizer. And, a lot of times now where you're in a meeting and you want to be able to log that meeting into Notion or Salesforce or wherever it is that you're going to keep track of that, it also does that really well. So like when you think about Read now, given what's happened in the last, 8 months in the AI space, has it changed in terms of your original thoughts about how this was going to show up for sentiment and how now this is showing up for lots of other things?
100%. So when we started, the first year that we started Read, a lot of R&D, trying to find product market fit, and we were able to measure both engagement and sentiment in real time by participant. And we were able to automatically do that and do it with a high level of accuracy that we would show everybody. They could see it in real time and they can question if it is or isn't accurate. And most people said this is actually really accurate. The problem that we ran into with that was, what is the use case? So this goes back to place. They're like, this is cool. You're showing me that 6 people aren't paying attention on this call, but what do I do with this? I'm now more nervous that you're showing me this data versus like, if I didn't see it, I would have thought I was doing well. So we took that feedback and we said, what are people looking for? And what people were looking for at the time was transcription, give me a recap. But what happens with the transcript, it's more like insurance. It's going in and saying, if I forget something, I will reference it. But 9 times out of 10, I will never, ever look at that transcript again. It's not of high value. Then ChatGPT came along and said, you can take those and we'll summarize it. And that already existed. There were models that you could do that. They just made it a lot simpler and more robust in a lot of cases. But then we said like, hey, do we want to do that? And the answer was like, no, everyone can do that. Anyone can just dump in a transcript and do some prompts. Then we said, what if we actually combined the reactions that we receive from people? So on the sentiment and engagement side, we're not just looking at the audio, but we're looking at, are you nodding your head? Are you engaged? Are you asking a question when someone stops? Or are you looking away? Are you kind of frustrated? Are you furrowing your brow? And those things actually play a role in terms of the quality of the summary that comes up. What is an action item? What is a key question? And so we took that, we annotated kind of the text that was there, and we put it into different models, and we started to go in and we started to build our own. We did our own clustering, plus we used some of the third-party services out there, and we created a better meeting summary than anyone else has out there. And that's table stakes, but it's going in and saying we summarize meetings better than anybody else because we take a multimodal approach of audio plus video for all participants. And the way that I describe it, it's a combination of having a narrator in a book as well as a studio audience. So imagine if you read a book and it was only the quotes. Yeah, that'd be interesting. You'd probably get something out of it. But that narration layer to say, David said this, but Boaz reacted this way versus Susie reacted that way.
Yeah.
That gives you more context. And if I know what you're interested in when I'm talking, that summary I can make an adjustment to. If I know 10 out of the 16 people were very interested in the third thing that I said, that moves up on the list in the summary versus 15 out of 16 didn't care about what I did this weekend. And then when we went in and said, okay, you've got the summary. What else can you do? Then we started to go in and say, not just a summary, but can you do video? And we took this approach of video. Can you automatically create video to take a 2-hour meeting and make it into a 1-minute clip? And so what we did was we call it a trailer. So if you ever seen the horror trailers where people are shocked, or the comedy, like there's a little bit of a setup and then the laughs come in. We kind of did the same thing, but we looked at engagement and sentiment. So we looked at those peaks of engagement, those peaks of sentiment, and then we cut up video so that people could watch that. Now they can go in and say, oh, okay, is this meeting relevant to me or not? Because it's showing me the high points. Then we took that a step further and we said, based on the reactions, based on what people are interested in, now create a highlight reel, which is more like an ESPN, where you watch a baseball game and it shows you those moments that actually make up that game. We did that automatically. So that got us more traction on board. Then we went in and said, hey, we've got all this stuff. Can you actually make recommendations using the AI? So how do if I know this meeting is good or bad for this person, how can I customize the recommendation for that person to have a better future meeting? So this might be being optional for the meeting, making the meeting shorter, adding fewer people onto the call. And so this is where we saw significant uptake, because this is not only AI just going in and saying, gives me a summary, but it's actually going in and saying, make my next meeting better. Give me those nudges, just like Waze or Google Maps will make my commute better. You know what I did, like last week when I drove home. Now give me a prediction based on what you have available on what should I be doing. How can I make this experience better?
That makes total sense. So the question I was going to ask you, that as you were talking, I was thinking, okay, well, obviously there's other startups that are competing for this space. There's incumbents that are competing for this space too. And so when you think about competing against those, a lot of it is around sentiment and being able to have better summary than you would otherwise have by just using a large language model to take the transcript and create a summary. I mean, at the end of the day, I want to, as a customer, come back to the summary, and I want to be able to think in my head, wow, how did they do that? How did they understand what was so important about that meeting? Is that fair to say?
100% fair. And with the incumbents that are the platforms, we actually partner with them very closely. For Zoom, we're a Zoom Essential app, great partners of ours. With Google Meet, we're a launch partner for their Google add-on apps. So this is kind of an app experience that they have in place. So we are very much friendly with them. And where we see the opportunity is, one, they're going out in the market and educating people that this is available. So this is a feature that's available, but it's not necessarily their core for every single day. That's their core product. The platform is the everyday product, and they have different features associated with it. And I think for us, where we see the value proposition is to go deeper on that feature, to go in and say, it's not just a single meeting, but it's a series of meetings. It's understanding what you are interested in across a series of meetings, going in and making recommendations within your calendar, being able to work across platforms. So half of our users actually use multiple platforms. So they use Google, they use Zoom, they use WebEx, they use Teams. So if you have that fragmentation, you need to bring it all together. And the best way I kind of describe it from an ecosystem perspective is Facebook and Google have very large advertising businesses. A lot of people would argue they're walled gardens. You don't get to play in there. They've got their own attribution. They've got their own advertising. They've got their own tracking. But there's companies that come in that play in that ecosystem that they're able to work and plug into Facebook, Google, Snapchat, video inventory, Roku, Amazon. And when you're able to go in and work across those platforms, you actually have a more robust solution. And a great example of that is the Trade Desk, which is a platform for media buying, where they don't sell any media, they don't own any inventory, but they've built a business that's market capped at about 50 billion today.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. It got me thinking about meeting management. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Because we spend so much time in meetings these days, and a lot of your value proposition is helping me understand how to be better at meetings. Can you talk a little bit more about how you think about that?
Yeah. So with meetings, the problem that we run into, and this is at the core, is we haven't been trained to say no. So if I send you a meeting invite, my instant reaction is to say yes. Maybe I'll follow up with a question, or I might just go to the meeting and say, "Why are we doing this?" Mm-hmm. And so that's problematic. We're too polite, and we're too polite that we don't want to say no, because when you decline a meeting request, I know I get declined sometimes, and I'm like, "Why'd you decline this? What's going on?" Like, you almost take it personal. Yeah. But in reality, the meeting request shouldn't be that personal. It's really transactional at the end of the day. Just like with Google Maps, no one gets offended when it says make a right turn when you're used to making a left turn, because it's going to save you time. I think the same goes for meetings. And so where it starts with meetings is the ability to actually say, was it a good meeting or a bad meeting? And if you're able to understand, was it a good meeting or a bad meeting, you can go into the metadata and start to understand what are the features that made it a good or bad meeting, and then what can you do moving forward to prevent that. So we've got a product called Smart Scheduler. It's a Chrome extension that works with Google Calendar. And what it does is it takes the learnings from all of your past meetings, and it goes in and gives you nudges. So I know that after 4 people in a meeting, my engagement rate drops by 27%. So it'll actually say, if you have that 5th person, engagement's going to drop by 27%. Hey, have you thought about making this meeting 30 minutes shorter because the meeting score is going to go up by 15%? Hey, did you realize that there's a 3-hour block here for everybody else except you? This is not the best time to actually have this meeting. So it's actually going in and using my existing workflow, but it's going in and taking that knowledge and just giving me those subtle nudges to make that experience better.
That is really interesting. I've been thinking a lot about my meeting time and how to bucket meeting time. It's an overall calendar strategy, but being really, really intentional about when you have meetings on what days. And so a lot of the way that you think about this is in line with that. You know, it's like saying, hey, time is valuable. Let's make sure that if we are going to sit down and have a meeting together, that we're doing that in a very intentional way. And I love that.
Absolutely. And the problem that you run into today with the intentionality is important, because Shopify, great company, they had meeting bankruptcy at the start of the year. They got a lot of press. They said, hey, we are canceling all meetings, and the only way you can schedule meetings is if you do X, Y, and Z. It's a good way to do it, but it's kind of like if you're in the Civil War and you got a bullet wound and you cut your arm off. Like, that probably wasn't the best way to do it now. Like, there are ways to do it smarter. And I think the feedback that you saw is like, it had meaningful impact, but how long is that impact going to last? When your boss wants to meet with you for an hour, are you going to say no in that instance? Are you going to get back into those old habits? Because if you clean it up once, you're going to have to do it again in most cases. Like, I remember in the old days, we used to have no meeting Wednesdays or no meetings after 3:00. But if something comes up, you have to meet. So I think this is where AI and technology comes into play, is to go in and say, how do I subtly kind of organize things behind the scenes without being offensive, without feeling like it's cutting off an arm, but it's going in and saying, hey, just move this back by 30 minutes. It's going to be better.
Yeah, that makes sense. Is your team fully remote, or are you guys in Seattle mostly? What's the makeup of your team? Where do you work? What's that hybrid situation look like?
Yeah, so it's about 60% in Seattle, 40% remote. So we wanted to kind of take that approach, and it was important because as a meeting company, it's important to actually use video conferencing. And the second part of that is you want a mixed approach, because what we're seeing now is not that video conferencing activity is dropping off. You're just getting mixed experiences now, where there's a group of people in a conference room and there's 4 people that are remote. And you're starting to see that happen more and more. We were able to get into that early and really start to understand, how do we handle a conference room where there's multiple people versus everyone's on a single screen like you and I are right now, and being able to see each other. This is the easy part when it comes to audio video. The harder part is when there's multiple people. So we built our models against that to identify different voices, to identify different silhouettes of people that are in the conference room. And so we've kept with that, where we want to be kind of that hybrid approach. the people that work here, a lot of people I've worked with in the past. So it's been an opportunity to kind of bring in those Seattle folks, but there's also bright minds across the US that I've worked with, that I haven't worked with, that we've been able to bring together.
It's an interesting time to think about that. When I was at Meta, we talked a lot about meeting equity, because you'd have some people in the office together. You'd have some people, calling in remote. And now that technology companies are asking a lot of people to come back to the office, that's going to be, even worse. You're going to have people that are calling in remote that might not have the same command of the room as the people that are together. But you're thinking about that, it sounds like, and you're being able to kind of understand what that looks like and maybe coach people on next steps around what that looks like for equity in a meeting.
100%. And that's where kind of the inclusivity comes in, where you're going in and saying, we've got a meeting with 12 people, 2 people are remote. If they don't say anything over the next 3 or 4 weeks, you'll be able to go in and get those nudges to say, hey, you might want to get them more involved in the conversation, or make them optional, or let them not come to this meeting, because it's not the best setup when you're inviting 2 remote people when there's 12 people in the conference room. And so again, those nudges are not someone like a peer or a manager telling you, do this differently. Because just by nature, when someone gives you feedback, like people say feedback is a gift, like most people don't take it as a gift. They take it hopefully just flat, but sometimes they take it personally. And so in that instance, when the AI can go in and just give that nudge directly to you, that becomes infinitely more valuable. It's like, you know what? I haven't participated in this call in the last 4 weeks. I don't like being on this thing. I always ask myself, why am I here? Hey, I'm just going to decline this, and I'm going to ask these 2 people if we can meet separately. And so that gives you a better outcome, where you might not have been able to do that without a lot of ruffling of feathers in the past. Now you're able to very simply do that because, hey, I just checked the box because it made a recommendation.
Do you think that people take feedback, constructive feedback, easier from a computer than they do from a human?
I would say yes. Because how are you going to get angry at a computer, right? Like, and I think the most classic example is backseat driver driving a car. People get really angry when someone tries to tell them how to drive, the direction. You're going too fast, you're going too slow, do this. I've never heard anyone say, Google, what are you talking about? This is messed up. I'm super pissy. Like, they're like, no, this is great. They love it so much that they'll change it to Morgan Freeman's voice to tell them directions.
Absolutely. Touching back on one other thing about remote work that I think is interesting, as a CEO in the early days of Place, let's say, where there wasn't a lot of video meetings, what are your thoughts about hybrid and remote work in terms of being able to get talent that was hard to get when everyone had to be together? Do you have a position on that?
I think it's great from a talent perspective. I think we're still in the early days, to be upfront. I think you heard about, hey, you could hire someone of same skill set that is in South America, as in Asia, as in Europe. Those things are things that are coming into play, but you're seeing a little bit of a pullback now in that area. It's a little bit more difficult. They realize there's a lot more overhead. Like, yes, they can do the same amount of work. They can probably do it even cheaper, better in certain cases. But there's a lot of overhead to set that up. There's a lot of management that you need to do that you don't factor into the equation. But I will say, like, we've got people that have worked in very remote locations that we wouldn't have been able to bring on board, but we knew that their talent was there. We knew that their experience was there, that we were able to kind of go in and bring them into the fold, and they've had a material impact on the business. So I think it gives you the opportunity, when in the past you'd have to say goodbye to someone because they had to move away, because they had a family obligation, they had to do something else. Now it's not goodbye. It's just, hey, it's more remote. But I think this is where there's a lot of push going on right now, technology around asynchronous meetings. So not meetings that you have live, where if I'm talking to someone in China that I need to be up at like 2 a.m. to actually make the call on their side in the afternoon. Those things are very difficult to do. But what we're seeing is people starting to have meetings where they can get people who are available on the call. But as you're able to kind of slice it up, where you've got highlights, where you've got summaries, now all of a sudden they're dropping that into Slack. They're putting it in Notion. And these meetings are getting kind of replaced, where you don't need to have these meetings because the content is already being delivered into the system. Like, we just introduced an integration with Zapier, and then we've got webhooks, where people are putting these into the most interesting spaces that we didn't necessarily expect. And they're like, no, this is great. Now I don't have to do a meeting. Now this person doesn't need to be on a call. We're getting more requests where people are saying, is it okay if I just send Read instead of me attending this call? And we're like, absolutely. Like, just check your setting here. We'll join the call on your behalf. And they're like, this is great. I don't have to go to calls anymore.
That's huge. And people are going to sign up for that all day long.
And I think that's the benefit of like AI. If you can trust that kind of solution to take the right notes, to give you the summaries, to identify those takeaways, and then let you drill in when you need to, either through a transcript, a video, or even asking questions. I think that's where the benefit is going to come into play for AI. It's not going to be jobs that are gone. It's going to be the mundane tasks that disappear. It's going to be those reminders where I used to have like 15 notepads before Read that I would just write different things. And I'd have to remember to look at this thing at this time, and I find it. And somehow I was able to do most of it, but I would miss a lot. Now I just have a list that goes in and says, hey, after every meeting, after every call, it takes the action items, it takes the key questions. I'm able to reference it. And that's where I think the value is with AI. It's taking away that mundane task that isn't of high value and opening it up for more work to do that it's more higher value that you might not have been able to get to.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you on that. Has there been a mentor in your life that has been really impactful to you over the years?
Yeah, I think, of course, parents, from the hard work perspective, really kind of putting in the hours to make sure that we were set up well. I think my mom worked till like 7, 8 o'clock, then made dinner when she got home, took care of the kids, took care of the house, then went back out at 5 a.m. to go back to work. So I think same for my dad. And I think those two things have been great as mentors. I would say from a business perspective, it is, I did find mentors along the way because I didn't necessarily have that experience where I could go to someone and say, hey, how did you do that contract? How did you incorporate? How do you handle management experience when you do X, Y, and Z? And so from that perspective, early on, Steve Jarvis was a big mentor of mine when I was coming out of college. He was an exec at Alaska Airlines back in the 90s and 2000s. Great guy. Like really, I was able to pick his brain. Like, how do you handle this? This person I'm working with is really not delivering. What do I need to do? And what's the right way to present this? Then it became, as we started the startup stuff, Matt McElwain, incredible like mentor, where initially when I came on board, I didn't know anything about VC. I didn't know how to talk. I didn't know what numbers you needed to look at. And he took, when he was the early investor in Placed, where I was like, oh, I'm going to try to do this myself. I've got a little money saved up. I think I got 1 or 2 people I can bring on board. He's like, well, we do seed investing at Madrona. I've seen what you did at Faircast. Like, I'd love to kind of be able to support you in this kind of vision that you have. And back then, $300,000 was a lot. Like now, $300,000 isn't even a pre-seed round. But we had $300,000 that he gave to this first-time founder, really, like official founder. And he was able to kind of guide us to like ask the tough questions without making the decisions. So like, hey, you've got a great product or you've got a great technology, but no one's buying it. What should we do next? Like, here's what I've seen for other companies that have happened. So I think he's really been able to guide the way there as well.
That's really cool. Matt was on the show previously, and really interesting to hear him talk about AI and the way he thinks about it. And he talks about you fondly. When you think about the future of AI and the work that you're doing, what do you think are the big emerging technologies in the next 5 to 10 years that you're thinking about, that you think the audience should be thinking about as well?
Yeah. So with AI specifically, I think we're going somewhat in the wrong direction when it comes to the question asking. So everyone talks about, I can ask a question of a picture. I can ask a question of a PDF. I can ask a question of a meeting. Like those are all interesting, but the closest analogy that I can give to that is Ask Jeeves. Ask Jeeves was, for the people that are a little bit younger, it was a search engine where you would ask questions and it would give you results and it would give you answers. That ultimately lost because questions are a lot of work. You almost want content delivered to you. Google search one because you could just look for keywords and they give you the thing that you wanted to look for. But now if you look at kind of how people are consuming content, it's discovery, it's feeds. So if you go on LinkedIn, it's information based on what you've liked, what you've engaged with that starts to bubble up and people who are in your network. I think the biggest one out there for mass market is TikTok. TikTok is within 3 or 4 kind of videos that you watch, it's going to pick up, hey, how long are you looking at this video? Did you watch it again on replay? Did you click the like button? Did you look at the person's profile? And it starts to stack that to go in and say, deliver content that is interesting to you. And for Read, what we started down the process, and I think this is the overall market, is really more about that discovery piece. So we created a product called For You. And what that does is it looks across all of your meetings. So I had probably 30 hours of meetings this week. Across those 30 hours of meetings, I might not care about 18 of them because they're subjects where it's part of a team stand-up. It doesn't matter. But when I'm kind of nodding and I'm looking at the screen, I'm like, oh, that makes sense. Or I ask a question. Read will start to pick up what topics are interesting to you, just like if you push the like button.
Interesting. Yeah.
And what we'll do is we'll start to create summaries, not on the meeting, but on the topics. And it'll look across your meetings to say, what are you focused in on? And for us, like the last couple of weeks, when I look at it, it's like, okay, it's not meetings about productivity, but it's meetings like, how do we get Slack integrated so that we can push meeting reports in? And we just launched that 2 weeks ago. So now it's starting to go in and discover those things. And then we're going in and saying, let me push to me, what are the action items that are assigned to you? So now it's going in and saying, not for the single meeting, but stack those meetings together and give me the latest update on what are the things that I need to do. And it starts to give me a list that I can check off. And I think that's where the market should be going. It's going to be around that discoverability where AI is working in the background and it's giving you nudges as you go versus going in and you asking it questions. I think that's kind of more the search approach, which is great, but I don't think that's the ultimate end approach of AI.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you, actually. I think that a lot of the reasons why chat has been such a big thing, it just happened to be the thing that OpenAI used to show us what LLMs can do. It's not necessarily the thing that makes LLMs the most powerful. Very, very interesting. So I always like to end the show with this question. If you were to describe the future of work in 2 words, what would those 2 words be? And then you can elaborate.
Less monotonous. And if you think about, there's this whole push on agents. The idea here is like you could train your agents to do things and you can ask it questions. Well, on that discovery theme, on the presentation where things are getting pushed to you versus you're pulling it out, with AI running in the background, it's going to start to push these changes to you. It's going to start to say, I've seen you do this 15 times. Do you want me to take this over for you? I've learned based on this. Hey, I noticed that you were on 12 meetings where you were talking about integration of HubSpot into your platform. Well, do you want me to write a PRD on that? So now it's going in and it's saying, hey, I don't need to think what I want to do with this, but I can actually get recommendations like, hey, I would love a product requirements doc because these are meetings that I want to do. Or, hey, across my team, there's 5 product managers. Across those 5 product managers, they've interviewed maybe 25 people about the product. Do you want an aggregation and do you want kind of a PowerPoint deck about these things? I think that's where the future is going to go. So the monotonous tasks of like, I need to write these down. I need to put this into Notion. I need to put this into Excel. Those things will be less and less because the AI will take care of it on the back end. And I think that's going to allow the dangerous side could be like, oh, I'm going to lose my job. These people are going to lose a lot of jobs because these are mundane tasks that have millions of people working on it. The positive side, if you look at the other way, is like, this frees up time to do more critical thinking. This frees up time where you're not doing the same thing, but you can challenge yourself and actually push the limits of what's possible because time is no longer a constraint.
I love that notion. That's amazing. And I really, really appreciate you coming on the show. It was really fun to talk with you. And I'm excited for Read and I'm excited for you. And it's a good time to be doing what you're doing. So thank you very much for joining us today.
100%. Thanks a lot. Appreciate it.
All right. That's a wrap. Thanks for tuning in. It was so fun to have David on this episode, and I loved hearing his stories about what it takes to run a venture-backed startup. If you want to learn more about David, please follow him on LinkedIn and Twitter and keep up with his activity online. I'm always amazed by the guests that we have on this show, and I'm really, really excited about the guests that are coming in the future. Thank you for listening to this episode. Please subscribe for future interviews. And as always, the Shift AI podcast is brought to you by Simply Augmented, and the theme music is by Dave Angel.